Hi, Donovan. Let me first start off by saying I love the show. I really liked the episode about that warehouse worker who was attacked by some creature you released a few months ago. I've got a very interesting story for you, and a picture that, well, no one can explain. Well, at least no one that I used to work with. I work for an outfit that did government contract work. We work with all branches of the military, but specialized in running mock scenarios for special forces. Now, I can't get into too many details, but my job was security. I was the head of security for our facility located in Northern Virginia. We basically paid and trained civilians to be part of different training exercises for the military, such as hostage situations. That was a smaller part of our business, and we also had two other divisions. Under our facility was a fallout shelter. That's where this story takes place. Our facility has been around since the 50s, and the shelter really isn't supposed to be used anymore, since there are other shelters nearby. However, we still monitor the shelter as part of our security protocol. I had a few techs who monitored the entire facility. We had a little over 300 security cameras throughout the building and the outdoor areas. There were 5 placed in various spots in the shelter, too. This took place in August of 2005, where one of my techs noticed something strange going on with one of the shelter cams in the east wing. It would fizzle out like an old VHS tape with tracking issues at the same time every night at 3:13 a.m. This happened 3 nights in a row. It would last for a few minutes, then the camera would come back online and was perfectly fine. After the 3rd night, we replaced the camera. Now, the camera down there was antiquated, but there wasn't anything wrong with it from what my tech could tell. So we replaced it with a new one, and sure enough, the same thing happens at 3:13 a.m. But this time, at 3:12 and 59 seconds, we see this right before it glitches out again. So my tech brought that to me the next morning when I returned to work. I was coming in and he's waiting for me because he had stayed late after his shift ended to show me this. My jaw dropped when I saw it. We had the shelter locked down. There's only a handful of people who could ever access it, and I can tell you that none of them were down there at 3:13 a.m. in the morning. What you see in the picture, it appears to be a man or something human-like that is coming up from one of the corridors into an area that splits off. The cage there is designed to protect an electrical box. The photo is actually zoomed in pretty far. I couldn't send the original because it has some identifying information on it, and I'm not at liberty to share those details. Anyways, I have no idea what or who this thing was. My tech didn't even see it at first because it just appeared for literally 1 second, and then the tape goes all fuzzy and starts to glitch. He had to rewind it to go through it frame by frame to see it. Like I said, no one has access to this area. This ended up happening every night for the next week or so, and then it just stopped happening. We checked the facility every night, and there was no evidence of this thing being down there. No doors were breached. It's something that no one was ever able to explain. We always referred to him as the boogeyman after that. It's super creepy. I hope your audience enjoys this. Take care. Hey there, Donovan. I had a really strange experience a few weeks ago that I want to share. I told a few of my friends about it, but they just laughed at me and said I imagined the entire thing. I was rambling around Cades Cove in Tennessee, and I finally found this really cool cemetery with a lot of old headstones. I'm kind of a cemetery nut. I used to do a lot of charcoal rubbings. I find the designs on the old headstones so interesting, much more so than the modern stones. I had wandered around for a while. I guess I had gotten turned around. It was time for me to head back out to the valley since I had a 3-hour journey ahead of me, but I couldn't find the gate where I'd come in. After about 20 minutes of following past, only to come up against yet another wrought iron fence, I was pretty irritated with myself. I started looking for another person to ask them where the gate was. but there wasn't anyone else there but me. I hadn't noticed it until I had to think about it. But the whole time that I was in there, I hadn't seen another soul. Now, I'm not the kind to usually get spooked out, but I was starting to feel a little apprehensive. It felt like I was trapped in there. I pulled out my phone, thinking I could pull up Google Maps, that app that can show you walking directions as well as your car, but I couldn't get my phone to turn on. That's when I got really impatient with myself, thinking that I'd let my phone die. And the worst thing was, I needed Google Maps to get myself out of Cades Cove. I was going to have to stop somewhere and ask for directions, and I hate doing that. I was seriously starting to think about hopping the fence. And then I noticed all the vines and wild roses, I guess, all winding through the fence, which means I'd most certainly get scratched up. I remember thinking, okay, that's weird. I didn't notice that before. And I started looking around, really looking now at my surroundings. There were fresh flowers on a number of graves. That was another detail that I was sure I hadn't seen before. When I got there, I had the impression it was just an old, forgotten cemetery. But obviously, someone still visited and put flowers on graves. It was then that I noticed a person some distance away, standing in front of one of the graves. I couldn't tell from where I stood if it was a man or a woman. All I could see was that it was a person dressed in all black, which made me hesitate to call out, like someone might be grieving. I walked over there and waited, a respectful distance behind the figure. Now that I was close up, I could see that it was a woman, in a long black dress and a hat like older women wear to church. I stayed silent, just waiting, figuring eventually she'd turn around, and I could ask her which direction the gate was in. She eventually turned around, and I was a little taken aback. The hat had a black veil that completely obscured her face. It was a little unsettling, because I was unprepared. I couldn't even tell if she was looking at me. I said, "Excuse me, ma'am. I've got myself turned around. Could you please point me in the direction of the entrance?" She didn't answer, but she started walking toward me, closing the distance. I wondered if her silence meant that she thought I was rude to having disturbed her. Since she was obviously in mourning, I quickly said, "I don't mean to bother you." No response, but she kept moving toward me until she was so close I had to take a quick step back. But she kept coming. Suddenly, I know this part sounds crazy. She wasn't in front of me anymore. I mean, completely vanished. I even turned around to see if she was anywhere in sight, but she was gone. I got chills all over. She looked real to me, but I wondered if I just imagined her. And then I thought, who imagines something like that? A person that's not there. Which got me wondering if I had schizophrenia or a brain tumor or something. Don't laugh. These thoughts really went through my head, and it was a terrifying prospect to think of. Then I looked back at the grave she had been standing in front of. It looked freshly dug, and there were flowers at the base that I assumed the lady had brought with her. White daisies bound with a red ribbon. I looked at the headstone, and that's when I really freaked out. I started to feel dizzy. The stone said Jonathan Wilkes, 1838 to 1889. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, so I closed my eyes for a minute and opened them back up. It was still there, and the headstone had one of those cool skull engravings that you see on old graves. Except this stone looked new. At that point, I thought, okay, this is some prank someone is playing. That was the only explanation. I looked around to see if I could spot someone hiding, watching me, or maybe even recording me. If there was someone there, they were doing a good job hiding. I even called out, "Very funny, but obviously fake," and waited. But no one came out of hiding. So I thought about the woman, and I figured finding her was the only way to keep my sanity. She couldn't have gone far. I walked around, following the path to the center of the cemetery. Since it was on a slight rise, I figured I'd be able to better spot her if I stood there. I'm walking along, going up the hill and looking around, and everything seems different. It took me a second to figure out why. Then I realized there were no fresh flowers on any of the graves. And also, what I could see of the fence from where I stood was completely bare. No wild roses or vines. I literally got chills running down my spine. This looked like a different cemetery. I started moving quicker, close to panicking. Only one thought was in my head. I needed to get out of here right now. So I went to the nearest fence and climbed over, rather awkwardly, but still happy to be outside the grounds. Then I bushwhacked a little, heading downhill, and eventually found the road. 10 minutes later, I was in my car, and glad to put that weird graveyard behind me. I got to the crossroads and automatically grabbed for my phone before remembering it was dead. But the screen lit up. It said there was a 35% charge left. Add that to all the weirdness, and I couldn't get out of the area fast enough. When I got back, I told some of my buddies about it. They all laughed and said I imagined the woman, the flowers, and the phone being dead. Then, one of my friends who's familiar with the area got real interested, saying that he'd never seen a cemetery on that road. So, in an effort to get someone to believe me, I agreed to go back with him a few weekends later. We drove up and down that road and all over the area, but we couldn't find that graveyard. I swear it was on that road, but suddenly, it's gone. I'm seriously considering having a CT scan to make sure there's nothing wrong with my brain. Has anyone out there ever experienced anything like that before? I think somehow I stepped back in time, as crazy as that sounds. Thanks for listening, Rick. I used to think stories like these were pretty limited to just a few spots with very low population density. But it's starting to sound like these things really don't care how many people are around. As a park ranger, I've worked in quite a variety of places. I'd never seen something that I couldn't explain, though. When I saw this creature I'm going to tell you about, I was living in Texas. It was about 5 years ago, and I was working as a park ranger in Big Bend National Park. I would sometimes do talks and presentations for visitors. It was one of my favorite parts of working in that field. Big Bend has a great history. It has mixed high desert and smaller mountains. It's just a gorgeous place. It's in the western part of Texas that goes downward along the bend of the Rio Grande on the border of Mexico. It was early in the summer, and I was preparing for a backpacking series presentation. I needed to get some pictures, and I decided to hike out near the area around Santa Elena Canyon. That part of the park opens up into a pretty flat area of the basin where the river gets real wide. It was in the late afternoon. I like to get those golden hour photos. There tends to be a lot more diverse wildlife around there. I'd parked my truck a distance away in a lot that serviced the trailhead. I had spent plenty of time there in the past. I was approaching the river basin near the mouth of the canyon when I saw something that looked unusual. Something was moving on the other side of the river, and it was big. My brain was scrambling, trying to figure out what category of creature it was. At first, I thought a mountain lion, but I knew instinctively that it wasn't. It was the size of a large man, but it was moving along really low to the ground. It was like a dark tan color, and it really struck me because of the way it was moving. It was like it had a bulk similar to a deer or something, but it was moving like a snake. Obviously, big mammals don't move like that, so I just kept staring at it, trying to make it out better. I kept moving back and forth, trying to get a good line of sight on it, and when I finally got a pretty clear view, I felt like my blood froze. I couldn't even identify what it was. It was very scrawny looking and really pale. It looked hairless and very humanoid, but it was creeping along low to the ground. I got the impression that it was hunting something. I could have probably thrown a rock across the water and hit it. It seemed to be totally focused on something off in the bushes. I stayed completely still so that I wouldn't make any noise. But then it turned its head and looked at me. It had these huge black eyes, and the mouth was hanging open in this creepy way. When it saw that I had seen it, it hunkered down even lower and seemed to scoot back, trying to hide. I managed to take a few photos, but I was so frozen in fear, All I could think about was surviving. I've never been so thankful for a river in my life, even though the river was pretty low at that time due to a drought. I'm sure there were some points that could be crossed without too much trouble, but it was still quite wide, and at least it provided a psychological safety barrier. The thing started to swivel its head back and forth, like it was looking between me and its original prey. I felt like it was sizing me up and trying to decide if I was worth the risk of hunting down. My heart was pounding, but I maintained my forward-facing direction. I started to slowly back away. Then its gaze fixated on me, and it started making this weird clicking noise. I was terrified that it had chosen me to be its dinner that night. I'll never forget that part, just waiting for it to decide which direction it was going to choose. I don't know if it decided I wasn't worth it or if the river was just too much of a barrier or what, but I could feel that moment when it almost seemed to lose interest in me, and it went back to stalking whatever was over there hiding in the bushes. I was able to get back to the truck without feeling I was being pursued, but it still felt like one of the longest walks I'd ever taken, even though it wasn't really that far. When I got back to my truck, I didn't even leave right away. I felt like I just wanted to stay there and watch out my window, in case it had decided to follow me. My brain was desperate to know what it was. I was honestly wishing it would reappear at that point, so I could try to get some pictures of it from the safety of my truck. I always remembered being parked there, listening to the occasional sounds of the typical wildlife that I was used to hearing. I stayed until it got completely dark, but I never saw a sign of anything out of the ordinary. I reported the sighting, but it probably sounded like gibberish, and my photos were crap. I'm pretty sure I was shaking like a leaf when I took them. I never saw something like that again, but it took a long time before I felt at all comfortable out there. That thing looked like something out of a nightmare. Hi, Donovan. It took me a while to decide to send this in to you. I've always been skeptical of people who claim to have seen extraterrestrial things. So when I had this sighting, it made me feel so excited. I kind of felt foolish. I was not expecting it at all. I know there are some people who are looking for these kind of experiences and actually take steps to search them out. But I think it's more likely to happen when you're totally not thinking about it. I never mentioned it to my boss or my coworkers. I didn't want to be labeled as a kook, but I know when you guys read things on air, you don't use names, so I'm sending it in. The state park I work for is really one of the most beautiful places that I've ever been. It has a nice mix of beaches and trails, and you couldn't ask for a better environment to work in. It's the Emerald State Bay Park in Lake Tahoe. I don't even know if I should say the name. I wonder if that makes people flock to the area. This place already does get really crowded. I've been a park ranger for quite a few years, and this is the busiest place that I've ever worked. This experience I had happened in 2019. I had spent some summers out here with my family when I was a kid. My dad really liked to rent a boat and hang out on the water all day. So I loved this place for a long time. We would kind of alternate between here and Lake Havasu for our summer vacations. I never thought I would end up being employed here though. During summer holidays, the place can be a madhouse. I was on duty on the 4th of July that year, and it was a really crazy day with all those people. After my shift, I decided to go up to Inspiration Point to take in the fireworks show. Lake Tahoe puts on one of the best shows in the country, if you ask me. I got myself some snacks and found myself a good spot to relax. I knew all the little secret areas, so I wasn't near any people. The show started off as usual and was fabulous. About halfway into it, I was looking off to the west a bit, and I saw several orange orbs start to float up toward the sky. I remember thinking something like, those must be some sort of those Chinese lanterns. Then, as I was watching them, I thought maybe they were embers from the fireworks or something, but they were incredibly bright, so that didn't really make sense since the embers would be fading. They floated up, and they seemed to form into kind of a W shape. They started to look like they were remote controlled or something. At first, they had looked like bright orange lights, but once they were up high, they looked brighter and whiter and started moving around. Then, they kept going higher and started looking like stars. They obviously weren't embers, but then, sort out of the middle of that W shape, there was this craft, or whatever you want to call it, that zoomed down lower and flew over my head. It was too fast for my eyes to really catch what shape it was, like fast as a bullet. It was still pretty high up there, but the lights on it were brighter than anything I've ever seen. And right after it passed over, there were like these little twinkles of light all in the sky right over my head. Like right over my head, not over the lake where the show was happening. The twinkles of light started making these incredible light streaks. I was beside myself. It wasn't like any technology that I had seen before. It sounds a little crazy that I had noticed this stuff while that amazing show was going on. Maybe it was because I was used to scanning the sky almost every night. The lights were behaving in this strange fashion. I can't quite explain it, but somehow those twinkles of light suddenly burst into dozens of lights in the sky. All of a sudden, they were moving together en masse, like some kind of squadron or something. It made me feel kind of anxious. But for some reason, I was also filled with this strange exhilaration. I just sat there in amazement, unable to comprehend what I was seeing, but knowing it wasn't normal. You could see the stars steady behind them as they were moving across. Then, the dozens of lights came together and went into a triangle formation, whereas before, they were just individually flying forward. Once they formed the triangle, I noticed that they were flying left to right, up and down. It was really surreal to have this amazing fireworks show going on. And there I was, completely ignoring it and watching this inexplicable sideshow. It wasn't that high in the sky, but not unnaturally low either. But eventually, the triangle seemed to just start ascending higher and higher, until I couldn't see the lights anymore. I have never seen anything like what I saw before that night. For the next few months, I kept watching the sky, trying to take notice of anything strange. But I never saw anything on that grand of a scale again. I'm sure people must think that what I was seeing was part of the show, but it absolutely was not that. I know there's some military activity not too far from here, so I don't know if it could have been connected to some testing or something like that, but I really don't think so. Anyway, I really appreciate the chance to share this here. I'd like to see something like that again, but now that I'm looking for it, it probably won't happen. It had been a long day, and a particularly weird one at that. Things at work kept seemingly disappearing, and then showing up in odd places. My computer screen kept flickering on and off. And twice I lost work before I could save it. The last thing of the day was an electric pencil sharpener not working for me. On top of that, I just felt drained. My energy level was just non-existent all day. In fact, all week. I would wake up in the middle of the night. I don't know why, but there was this feeling I kept having. I can't really explain it. I know that sounds odd, but I just can't bring it to words. Maybe dread was the closest I could relate it to. Maybe that's too cliche. I don't know. People had begun to notice how tired I was looking. Dark rings around my eyes. Eyes that were more often than not bloodshot. I'd forget things. I'd lose my temper at odd times. I was a mess, really. After work, I came home and just dropped onto the couch. I didn't have any energy to do anything, really. I turned on the TV and flipped through the channels. I didn't even have the energy for that. I just left it on something and then I began to drift off, I guess. I don't really remember. That's when it happened. I was just lying on the couch. I remember opening my eyes and feeling strange all of a sudden. My arms had goosebumps, and I had a feeling of slight panic. I tried to get up, but I couldn't. I couldn't really explain why. My body just wouldn't move for me. Suddenly, it felt like there were hands on my shoulders, and something was holding me down. I tried to move. I remember I kicked my legs a little, but this force just held me down. It felt like fingers digging into my shoulders, and I couldn't catch my breath. I swore for a second I saw the outline of a face. Not details or anything, just the faint outline of a face, like these deep sunk eyes, sunken cheeks, and a mouth wide open, like it was inhaling something over me. I couldn't catch my breath. I started to really panic, and that made me move more. I started moving my shoulders and my arms, trying to push whatever it was that was on top of me. I could feel it holding me, but I couldn't feel it when I kicked up towards where it should be. Suddenly, it let go of me, and I jumped off the couch. The door to the room slammed shut. I can't explain it, but then I felt alone. I was covered in this cold sweat. I was feeling dizzy. I started to walk towards the kitchen when the TV suddenly shut off, then turned on again, the volume turning up higher and higher. I covered my ears with my hands and tried desperately to turn it down with the remote. The TV just turned off. It felt like something knocked me over. I fell to the floor and I could swear something jumped on me, pinning me down. I had this huge pressure on my chest, so much so that I couldn't breathe. I tried to get up to call out, but I couldn't. Then the room began to spin and everything went dark. That's when I woke up 3 hours later. I got my keys and ran out the door for my car. I didn't know what else to do, so I drove to the hospital. Apparently, I looked pretty bad because they took me in immediately and hooked me up to fluids and had me in a bed. 3 bags of saline and 48 hours of uninterrupted sleep, and I could feel somewhat normal again. The doctors and nurses asked what happened to me. What could I tell them? I didn't know what to say. After hours of not saying anything, that's when they had the psychiatrist come in. My story came to me immediately when that happened. It was work. I wasn't sleeping. I was overworking myself, and I was consuming too much caffeine. I tried to make it sound as normal as possible. I don't know if the doctor believed me or not. They kept me for another 3 days, though. When I was released, it took me a long time to go home. I drove around for a while, went to a restaurant to eat, but I eventually made my way home. I sat there in my driveway, my hands clenched on the steering wheel, and I saw something in my house. I saw it move past the curtains. This dark silhouette that suddenly dropped out of sight. I tried to take a picture, but nothing came out on my camera phone. I left right after that. I drove 12 hours to my parents' house in Tennessee. I didn't know what else to do. I told them everything, the entire story, and prayed that I didn't sound like a crazy person. I must have, though, because my father, well, I don't really know what he thought. My mother seemed to believe me, and I stayed at my parents' house for a few weeks. That was that. I was moving immediately. I don't know what happened, but I wasn't staying in that house. As soon as I could, I had it up for sale and got my stuff out as fast as possible. We moved out during the day, and I spent as little time as possible in there. Things happened to the movers and my parents as well. Things would disappear in the house. The movers felt uncomfortable, but maybe that was because they kept seeing me. I'm sure I couldn't hide my fear as well as I should have. I moved back in with my parents after that, but I keep track of the house. Eventually, it went to a married couple. Months went by and nothing seemed to happen. I still have nightmares. I still can't sleep at night that well. I don't know what happened. I can't really explain it. Nothing like that has happened to me since, and I pray that it doesn't happen again. I never believed in weird or strange stories before. I'd always say that people were making it up or something. That was until something weird happened to me. That changed my life. Now I can't help but to think there's some truth in everything people encounter. Details might not be clear, whatever, but it doesn't mean it didn't actually happen. I was riding the train into Chicago. It's a great experience, it really is. And it shows you how people used to travel back before the invention of cars. People make fun of me for how much longer it takes, but it's just the experience of it. There's always a few interesting people in the train as well. I spent many hours drawing the different people sitting on the train. It's a great exercise for anyone who's into the arts, and great practice drawing people in motion, learning anatomy. I also like to look out the window at the different stops the train makes. During one of these stops, I was looking out the window, kind of daydreaming and not really paying attention to anything. Something or someone moved and caught my eye, and I turned my head to see this girl. She was alone. No one was standing around her. Her back was turned to me with this long blonde hair that almost reached the small of her back. I didn't really think anything of it, and the train eventually went on its way. I began doodling, not really drawing anything, just making shapes and scribbles. 2 stops later, I swear I see that same girl. Long blonde hair, arms wrapped around a book held to her chest, standing there alone. This time, she turns her head slowly and looks right at me. Her eyes are solid black, shiny, almost like precious stones. Her face was expressionless, and she just stared at me until the train started up again. I thought maybe I didn't get enough sleep. Maybe I saw it wrong, or I was just imagining it because I'd been daydreaming on and off. Like when you get super bored sometimes, and you swear you saw something this way, or you picked up something from the store, but you actually didn't. I just kept telling myself that until we made the next stop. She was there again. This time people were walking past her, but it seemed like they didn't notice she was there. She looked right at me, eyes big and black, but it almost seemed like she was looking through me. This time, she got on the train. I panicked a little, dropping my pencil, my hands shaking a little. I bent down to get my pencil from the floor, then just waited. Something told me she would end up in my train car. I sat in my seat waiting, sweating, my hands shaking every time I tried to draw. I looked around from time to time, but I didn't see the girl. I just stared out the window, trying to take my mind off what I had seen. I started to calm myself down a bit. An hour went by without me really noticing. I don't know why, but I began to look around at the people sitting around me. Far off at the opposite end from where I was sitting, I saw the top of a blonde head. The hair looked like it was straight. It looked like it could be that girl that I had seen at the other stops with the black eyes. I closed my sketchbook. I slid the pen into the metal rings that bound it and just started tapping my foot. Panic began to swell up inside me. Looking out the window wasn't working anymore, so I got up to find the restroom. When I walked back to my seat, she wasn't there anymore. The blonde head wasn't in the seat that I saw her in. I sat back down in my own seat and kept looking over from time to time. A half an hour went by and she didn't return. Then an hour. She still wasn't in that seat. Was my mind playing tricks on me? Was she even really there at all? Time seemed to fly by. Eventually, we made our way into Chicago. When I got up from my seat, I could have sworn someone touched my hair. I looked around, but there was no one near me enough to do that. I kept my eyes open as we got off the train, and as I made my way through the station, I called an Uber to bring me to my friend's house in Canaryville. I didn't have to wait long for the Uber, but I kept looking around trying to see that girl again. The Uber driver made small talk. He was a nice enough guy, but I just wanted to get to my friend's house as fast as possible. I still couldn't wrap my head around what had happened on that train. I looked out the window as Chicago passed by, taking in the city and the people. We get to my friend's and I pay the Uber. I get out of the car and I feel this cold chill run down my spine. I turn around and there she is across the street, her black eyes staring straight at me. and her blonde hair blowing in the wind. I run up to my friend's door and knock as fast as I can. He pulls it open. I almost jump inside his house. I point across the street and tell him what happened on the train. He starts laughing, but he looks across the street, and his face turns white. He sees her standing there. His mouth almost drops to the floor. She turns her head and nods towards us, then just disappears when a car drives by. We both lose it, and we go out of the house looking around for her. The neighbors are looking at us like we're insane. My friend goes and asks if anyone saw the girl standing across the street. One of them did, but didn't understand why we were acting so crazy. We stayed up all night talking about it with some of our other friends. We kept looking outside, waiting to see if this girl would show up again across the street. As a Yellowstone park ranger, I was often out on routine hikes as part of my job duties. These hikes were meant to help me familiarize myself with the park's trails and to keep an eye out for any potential hazards or issues that might need to be addressed. It was also an opportunity for me to observe and interact with the park's wildlife, as well as educate visitors about the importance of preserving and protecting the natural environment. On this particular day, I was out on a routine hike because it was part of my regular patrol schedule. I was walking along this narrow trail that led through a dense forest when I heard this rustling in the underbrush. I stopped and listened carefully, trying to determine what was causing that noise. It sounded like it was getting closer, so I slowly reached for my bear spray just in case. Suddenly, a massive creature burst out of the trees and onto the trail in front of me. It was a wolf, but unlike any wolf I'd ever seen before. This wolf was standing on two legs like a human and towering over me. It had this dark brown fur that was shining in the sunlight. Its eyes were piercing and they looked intelligent. Its jaws were strong and powerful, filled with sharp teeth that were bared in a snarl. Its claws were extended, ready to attack, and it seemed to be sizing me up, as if it was trying to decide whether or not to attack. Overall, the wolf had this intimidating and aggressive presence, and I could tell that it was a formidable predator. I froze, unsure what to do. The wolf seemed to be sizing me up. Its eyes narrowed and its lips pulled back in a snarl. It was clearly agitated. I could see that it was ready to attack. I slowly backed away, trying to keep my distance from the wolf. But it was no use. It was too fast. It just lunged at me, its sharp teeth bared and its claws extended. I tried to fend it off with my bear spray, but the wolf was too strong. It knocked me to the ground and began to bite and claw at me, determined to bring me down. I fought for my life, trying to escape from the wolf's grasp, but it was no use. It was just too powerful. I was certain it was going to kill me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Just when I thought it was all over, the wolf suddenly stopped attacking. It looked right at me with its piercing gaze, then turned off and ran into the forest, disappearing into the trees. I lay there on the ground, battered and bruised, but somehow alive. Honestly, it was a miracle that I had survived that encounter. I was eventually rescued by a team of rangers and rushed to the hospital, where I was treated for my injuries. The bite marks were deep and numerous, and it was clear that I had been attacked by a large predatory animal. But when I tried to tell the authorities about the strange bipedal wolf that attacked me, they dismissed my claim and insisted that it must have been a gray wolf or a bear. They even went so far as to cover up the incident, pretending that it never happened. I knew that what I had seen was real, and that the authorities were just trying to protect the reputation of the park. But I also couldn't prove it, and that I would have to live with the memory of that terrifying encounter for the rest of my life. I've thought about that moment many times since that day, and I have a few theories about why that wolf might have stopped attacking me. One possibility is that the wolf just simply lost interest in attacking me. It may have been agitated or provoked by something else, and my presence may have simply been a coincidence. Once it had satisfied its aggression, it may have just simply lost interest in me and decided to move on. Another possibility is that wolf was startled by something else. It may have heard or seen something that caused it to become distracted or frightened, and it may have decided to run away rather than continuing to attack me. Ultimately, I'll never know for certain why it stopped attacking me. It was an extraordinary and unexpected moment, and one that I'll always remember. Hi, Donovan. I'm very excited to be writing in as a fifth-generation rancher, who is also a fifth-generation skinwalker witness. My family is ranched out of New Mexico, and I've got 5 skinwalker sightings to tell you about. In 2020, I was moving cattle from New Mexico to Texas after selling part of my herd. I had one cow that was just refusing to be caught, so I went with an unconventional method of catching her. I decided to wait till she was asleep and sneak up on her with a rope. It was a little past midnight on August 4th, and I was heading out into the pasture on my ATV hunting her down. I found her asleep and standing up near the watering hole, so I parked the ATV so I could walk up on her with less noise. Just as I was getting close, though, I heard something pounding in the dirt behind me. I turned and looked, and there it was. I could only really see it by the light of the moon, but it looked like a human, twisted around walking on all fours with its knees pointed backwards. It looked at me with these glowing eyes, and I jumped back, startled at the sight. I took off on foot back to my four-wheeler. I figured I'd find another way to catch the old cow. I wasn't going to spend another minute out there with that thing. The whole way out of the pasture, I could see it in my peripherals running alongside me. Fortunately, I finally did manage to get away. But when we went out after the cow the next morning, she'd been just about picked clean. All that was left were her bones, laid out bleaching in the summer sun. My mom saw the same thing on the property back in 1979. She had retired from barrel racing in the rodeo, but still enjoyed working horses, and was out running one she just broke through that same field one evening when the skinwalker chased her. Just like with me, she said it looked like a twisted human with glowing yellow eyes. She and Dad divorced not long after that, because she wanted to sell the land and leave, but he refused. After all, it's a generational ranch. In 1966, my grandfather had also seen the skinwalker there. They were putting up a new barn on the northeasternmost corner of the ranch, and my grandpa had stayed out late to finish up some of the interior work after the lights were finally installed. He had both barn doors open, with the breeze flowing through the middle of the barn, as it was a pretty hot summer night, and he was wanting all the fresh air he could get while hanging the stall doors. As he was working, he felt something creep up beside him, and he thought it was his dog, a German shepherd he had called Martin. He reached out to pet Martin, but he didn't feel him there, so he looked to see where he was. That's when he saw the skinwalker, in the same form me and my mom saw standing in the middle of the barn hallway, staring right at him. He screamed and the skinwalker left, but Grandpa searched all over the ranch and never did find Martin. Years later, we'd find a dog skeleton laid out in the field. The bones were all broken up, like something had eaten it. In 1947, my great-grandmother Iris was hanging clothes in the backyard at the ranch, when her dog Maddie went barking and howling at something over the horizon. When she looked out to see what the dog was barking at, it was a great big bear, not something a person would expect to see out here in New Mexico. She called the dogs and the kids, and they ran inside, and she watched as the bear crept up closer to the house. They didn't have a telephone, so she couldn't call for help. She sent the kids to hide under their beds, and she pushed a hope chest against the door, hoping to keep the bear out. She heard the thing grunting and circling the house, pawing at the sides and scratching the glass at the windows. But she curled up in a ball and hid under the shelves in the pantry until the noise stopped, and it left. Afterwards, when her husband got home, they took a walk outside together to check on the damage. There wasn't a whole lot, but they found something even more startling. At one point while circling the house, the bear's footprints began to change. By the time it left the homestead and took off back over the hill, the bear's prints had turned into almost human-like tracks, with elongated fingers and toes. and a sharp claw poking holes in the ground at the end of each. The first reported sighting of a skinwalker in my family, though, was when my great-grandfather first bought the land in 1919. He saw it many, many times. He built the original house by hand and camped out in the tent on the land every night until the house was built. In his journal, he wrote about the skinwalker circling his camp often at night, watching the glow of the fire from a distance. He made peace with the skinwalker by leaving offerings of meat out for it at the top of the hill at the end of the valley. And every time the ranch has changed hands throughout its years, it comes with a warning about the skinwalker being there. Now, after what happened with the cow, my family is wanting to leave, but it's a generational ranch. Just like my dad, I can't bring myself to give it up so easily. All I can do is teach my kids about the skinwalker that lives here and how to protect themselves when it's their turn to face it down. I never used to believe that our dreams meant anything. I always thought people who kept dream diaries or who tried to apply hidden meanings to them were a bit on the crazy side. But I'm not sure how I feel anymore. About 10 years ago, my family was going through a personal crisis. I was about 25 at the time, and my younger brother was utterly possessed by drug addiction. He had been arrested a few times and even stole from my parents and from other family members. My mother refused to kick him out of the house, but she made him attend this 60-day inpatient rehab in the city. I had a friend who worked there, and she promised to keep an eye on him. The first few weeks were great, and my brother started gaining weight and would even laugh and joke around with us when we went to visit on Sundays. There was still a lot of hurt to mend, but that could wait for the future. We were all feeling hopeful and just wanted my brother to be okay. Right around the third week my brother had been in rehab, I started having kind of a reoccurring dream. A man I have never met nor remember seeing would be walking down the street. He had shoulder-length curly brown hair and these green eyes behind a pair of thick-rimmed glasses. His mouth was always in sort of a semi-smile, but not a smirk, almost like he was completely content with wherever he was in the world. Even though he was only walking, I could never catch up to him. After a while, he would always turn and look at me, and then that's it. I would wake up every time he would look at me. Like I said, I didn't really buy into any of that spiritual stuff and just figured out he was some guy in a TV show I watched or that I just can't remember. After about a week of having these dreams, I got a call from my friend down at the rehab. She told me that in the middle of the night, my brother had signed himself out. He wasn't court-ordered, and my parents, against my advice, had left a little cash with him in case he needed toiletries or something. I had a good idea of where he was going: Kensington, North Philadelphia. It's an incredibly open-air market for what he wanted. I considered leaving him to his fate, but he was my brother, and despite how angry and hurt I was, I loved him, so I went looking for him. I had a picture of him, but I didn't really think it would be of any use. Still, I tried. I walked around for hours showing the pictures to passerbys and pretty much waiting to get beat up or robbed at any moment. I walked for hours and hours. It was getting late, and as desperate as I was, I knew that staying after dark would be guaranteed trouble. I started heading back towards the bus stop when I thought I recognized someone standing at the end of the street. It was the man from my dreams. He stared at me for a few seconds, with that slight smile on his face, and then he turned and walked around the corner. I sprinted to catch up to him, momentarily forgetting about my brother. When I rounded the corner, I saw that he was already at the next block and turning again. There was no way, not even if I ran, that he could have made it that far. I kept running after him. Some of the other people on the sidewalk were yelling curses at me. We played that cat and mouse game for several blocks, and he turned a few more times. Finally, as I came speeding around another corner, I saw him standing in front of an alleyway. He turned to look at me, and then he walked down it. I trotted over to the head of the alley and peered down. The alley ended in this dead-end brick wall, and the guy was nowhere to be seen. Only a bunch of garbage and a dumpster. And that's when I noticed a pair of legs sticking out from behind the dumpster. Thinking it was the guy, I rushed over with a balled fist. But it was my brother. He was unconscious. I tried to slap him awake, but he wasn't responding. I pulled out my phone and called 911. Due to the sheer number of overdoses in the area, there were a lot of emergency response teams nearby. They got there in a few minutes and shot my brother full of Narcan and rushed him to the hospital. He survived, and not only that, the incident was enough to actually knock some sense into him. He's still clean to this day and owns a successful landscaping business. I wouldn't dream about the man for another 10 years. I became a dad recently to a little baby boy. The pregnancy was pretty rough on my wife, and we had a few scares, but in the end, we were blessed with a new addition to our family. Sleep, when it came, was restless, and over the last 2 weeks, I started dreaming about that man again. This time, he was just standing there, right in front of me, but at a weird angle, almost like I was looking up at him. No matter what I did, I couldn't touch him, and I would always wake up after a while. I chalked it up to bad sleeping or being too preoccupied with my son to give it any real thought. When my son was about 2 months old, my wife was finally starting to feel like her old self again. We had just laid the baby down for a nap, and my wife wanted to go visit her sister a few minutes away before the baby woke up again and was hungry. She deserved a little time to herself, and I wanted to trim some of the hedges out back, which was going to take 20 minutes tops. I had headphones on connected to the baby monitor, as well as an app on my phone that was connected to video. I could see and hear everything in the room. I was outside, my back turned to the house. I was almost done, maybe about another 10 minutes when I pulled out my phone to check on my son. There was someone standing next to his crib, staring right into the baby camera. It was the man. The same man from the day that I found my brother. In a full panic, I rushed into the house and right into the bedroom. I looked around quickly and I couldn't see him anywhere. Our house isn't that big. It's a single-story ranch. It only took a few seconds to check every other room. I went back into the bedroom to check on the baby, and my gut just dropped to the floor. Somehow, my little boy had wiggled around in his swaddle, and it had come up higher than it should, covering his mouth and nose. I couldn't see it from the camera angle. I frantically pulled it down to his chin and could see that his face had a slightly bluish tint to it. I pulled him out of the crib and placed him onto the bed, while simultaneously calling 911 from my cell phone. The person on the phone walked me through what to do while the paramedics came. But even as I followed her steps, my son's color started to return to normal, and he was breathing okay. The paramedics showed up a few minutes later, and still thought we should take him to the hospital just to be sure. I went with the van and called my wife to tell her what happened. But I was feeling better now because my son wasn't showing any signs of distress. We got to the hospital, my wife showing up a few minutes later, and sat right outside the room while the nurses and the doctors checked him out. The doctor eventually came out and confirmed that he was just fine, and no permanent damage had been done. She did tell us, however, that even a couple of minutes longer without breathing, and the result could have been devastating. This happened 5 days ago, and my son is doing just fine. We got rid of all the swaddles and opted for a sleeping sack instead. I've been doing some research on this stuff. This man, or whatever he is. That's how I found your channel. And while I'm still not totally convinced, and I'm sort of starting to believe that there might be entities or spirits in the world, and not all of them are bad. So who or whatever you are, thank you. I've always been open to the strange and paranormal. But recently, I had an experience that was so bizarre, there's no doubt in my mind that it was real. I live in Big Rapids, Michigan. I have this friend Steve who loves to scour the internet for supernatural and conspiracy stuff. One day, he came to my house all excited about something that he found on Reddit. To me, that was already a red flag. He said there's been chatter about a supposedly abandoned underground military bunker in the Huron-Manistee National Forest. I never heard anything like that and just laughed at him, but he tried to talk me into checking it out. I was skeptical, but he showed me the Reddit thread, which even had pictures from the alleged site. Someone posted coordinates and landmarks in case anyone wanted to look for it. Here's the thing. There were also sightings of a strange creature in the area, and people speculated that it was connected to the hidden bunker. I know your listeners are familiar with dogmen. There's tons of stories on your channel about encounters all over the country. Michigan is actually known for its dogman sightings, even in my hometown of Big Rapids. I've heard about it from some time from the old-timers, but I've never seen one myself. The creature that people describe sounded a lot like the dogman, basically a werewolf-type creature. Steve didn't want to go alone, and I finally gave in, as long as he treated me to an 8-corner all-meaty from Jet's Pizza. The Huron-Manistee National Forests cover nearly 100,000 acres. Steve followed a map, and the coordinates took us up a trail. But then we took a narrower trail and went deep into the woods. I had no idea where we were and began to worry. As we hiked, we heard rustling sounds nearby. I was a little concerned because there's bobcats and bears in the forest, and I'm pretty sure we weren't on any kind of official trail. I swore I smelled something too, like rotting meat and sulfur. It didn't bother Steve, so I kept my mouth shut. Then we heard something else. I don't know exactly what it was, but it sounded like a hyena, which would be crazy. It was fairly close, too. I said we should head back and that this was just a wild goose chase, but Steve insisted we were close and even pointed to a large white pine with carvings in the trunk that he was sure the Redditors mentioned. We finally came upon a small hill that housed a concrete door buried under a bunch of foliage. I couldn't believe it, and Steve had no qualms about rubbing it in my face. Still, I was worried about whatever animal made those weird sounds. Steve was only focused on one thing as he pulled open the door and went inside. I reluctantly followed. We used the flashlights on our phones to look around. It was mostly empty, except for some old beer cans. From the outside, you wouldn't be able to tell how big the place was. But as we went further, I realized it was a sprawling complex. There were several rooms, some with old dusty tables and cabinets and gurneys. It looked like a medical or a research facility. Steve took a lot of pictures. It's clear it hadn't been used in decades, but I couldn't understand how this place stayed a secret all these years. Steve said the Redditors thought the military did some kind of secret experiments during World War II. I would have laughed before, but at that point, I thought anything was possible. He was intent on finding something that would prove those theories. But outside of some old rusted equipment, there was nothing. I was hesitant to go any further, as the place was a large labyrinth. Steve made fun of me, but then we heard noises somewhere up ahead. It was the sound of clattering metal, like someone was knocking things over. I grabbed Steve and tried to head back, but he shook me loose and called out to whoever it was, taunting them. I thought he was nuts. Then we heard it, that hyena sound echoing in the concrete maze. It grew louder, and for the first time that day, Steve gave pause. That's when we saw it. At the end of this long corridor, a massive figure emerged. The flashlight wasn't strong enough to get a good look, but it was definitely an animal, prowling on all fours. It was huge, with stringy black fur and this wolf-like face. Steve took a picture, and when it flashed, a hyena laugh erupted from its throat as it stood up on its hind legs. That's when we saw that its upper body was actually human-like, with arms that put Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson to shame. This thing was huge, maybe 7 feet tall. Steve screamed and we both turned and ran. We heard the creature galloping behind us, closer and closer. We finally made it to the entrance, slammed the door shut, and kept going down the narrow trail. As we ran, we heard that hyena sound again, and something in the bushes behind us. Who knows if it was the same creature from the bunker or another one. We finally made it to the main trail, but we kept going until we got to the car. Nothing followed us. We stood there in silence for a few minutes as we caught our breath. I had a hard time processing what just happened, but Steve burst into a wide grin. He was excited about what we saw, and that he had proof to prove those conspiracies. Then the color drained from his face as he searched for his phone with all the pictures. It was gone. He probably dropped it somewhere in the bunker or the forest. I told him there's no way in hell we're going back. He got angry at me and demanded to know why I hadn't taken any pictures. All I could do was shrug. I got an earful from him as we got into the car and drove back. He kept his word, though. I enjoyed the pizza from Jet's. Turns out I worked up an appetite after almost getting attacked by a dogman. A week later, Steve told me that the Reddit thread had been deleted. He thought our encounter had something to do with it, like maybe the military was still watching that place. I thought it was for the better. No one should be snooping around there anyways. I grew up around Point Pleasant. As a kid, the Mothman was ubiquitous. Everyone had a story. Relatives, neighbors, friends, brothers, roommates, you get the idea. Just hearing about it always gave me the chills. My parents divorced when I was young, and me and my mom eventually moved out of Point Pleasant. I was an only child and I'd spent summers with my dad. I loved him, but I didn't feel like I was that connected with him back then. He used to take me camping a lot. He was an outdoorsman and he loved introducing me to the beauty of nature. It was okay, but honestly, I would have rather watched movies or played video games. During one of our trips, I wandered from our site to gather wood for a fire. The sun had already gone down and it was getting pretty dark. I wandered a bit too far, and as I looked around, I didn't see my dad or our tent. That's when I heard this strange clicking sound coming from up in the trees. I looked up and froze, dropping the sticks in my hands. A shadowy figure was perched high in the branches, maybe about 20 feet up. Two glowing red eyes pierced the darkness, staring right at me. They were big and round, and I remember being held under their spell, like I was hypnotized or something. I was convinced it was the Mothman. The branches creaked as the creature stood up and spread its massive wings. It swooped down from the tree, shrieking. I ducked and covered my eyes and felt this gust of wind as it skimmed over me. I stayed curled up in a ball, screaming, until I felt my dad pick me up and hug me. I said it was the Mothman as I sobbed uncontrollably. He calmed me down and we walked back to our tent, where he cooked us dinner of hot dogs and canned beans. We ate in silence, and he could tell that I was still bothered by the experience. We heard an owl in the trees, and he said a lot of times owls are mistaken for the Mothman. He took out a flashlight and shined it around the trees, trying to find the owl. Sure enough, he caught it, and its eyes reflected this orange-red glow. The owl flew off after being identified, but I was sure the creature I saw was much bigger. I asked him what the Mothman was. He thought for a moment, then he said it was a force of nature that we just don't understand. But it shouldn't be feared. Instead, it should be revered and respected. I never heard of the Mothman described that way, and I asked him if he ever saw it himself. He paused thoughtfully, smiled, and shook his head no. Normally after dinner, we'd stargaze and my dad would point out the constellations, but I just went into the tent and tried to go to sleep. That night, I had a horrible dream with a vivid imagery of fire, broken glass, and twisted metal. At the time, I had no idea what it meant, but it was so real. I woke up screaming. Once again, my dad had to calm me down. When I told him about my dream, he gave me a strange look. We weren't scheduled to leave until the following afternoon, but I was so unnerved I begged him to go home early. My dad was a good sport and didn't complain. As we packed up our stuff, I felt guilty and apologized for ruining the trip. He reassured me that everything would be okay, and that we'd make up for it with the movie night. As soon as we got onto Route 62, I felt much better. The next day, we were watching TV in the afternoon, and a breaking news story interrupted the program. Apparently, there was a major pileup on Route 62 after a big rig overturned. Several cars were involved, and there were fatalities. It stopped traffic in both directions for hours. My dad commented that it happened on the same route that we took home. If we stuck to our schedule and left the campground when we were originally supposed to, we very well could have been involved in that accident. He continued watching the news in silence, before finally turning to me and admitting that he did see the Mothman once when he was in high school. At least he thought he did. He and some friends were driving along Route 62 one night. They were drag racing. He knew it was a stupid thing to do, but they were just teenagers. Suddenly, a winged creature started following them. No matter how fast they drove, it easily kept up. He said it was dark and that he couldn't make out its features, but he never forgot its large glowing eyes. He and his friends slowed down, and the creature disappeared. That night, he had a dream exactly like the one I had. He thought it was a warning and vowed never to race again. Unfortunately, his friend died in a car wreck a few weeks later while drag racing. One of the things that you hear about the Mothman is that he brings doom. Like the infamous Silver Bridge collapse in 1967, that more or less introduced him. While some blamed him for that event and other tragedies over the years, my dad believed that the Mothman was just an omen. How you interpret it is entirely up to you. I know some will say he's evil personified, a servant of the devil or something like that. I don't think he's good or evil. He just is. He doesn't pick sides. But if you see him, set aside your fear and pay attention to what he's trying to tell you. I don't know what I actually saw that night in the forest. It was dark and my overactive kid imagination immediately saw a monster. But like my dad said, and even proved, it could have been an owl. I can't help but think that the sighting and my dreams were the Mothman trying to warn me, just like he warned my dad. I wondered how many other people he appeared to, and how many of them listened. The relationship between me and my dad changed that summer. We became closer. I guess sharing bizarre experiences will do that. I haven't seen the Mothman since, but I haven't been afraid either. My dad is old now, and we don't go camping like we used to, but I cherish every moment with him. In some way, the Mothman taught me that. Life is fleeting, and never take it for granted. Hey Donovan, the stories on your channel always intrigue me. People have had some pretty crazy experiences. I'm especially drawn to the ones in our great country's national parks. In the vast wilderness, mountains, and deserts, there's bound to be things hidden that we're just unaware of. I can attest to this, and would like to share my story. I'm a ranger at the Porcupine Mountain Wilderness State Park, also known as the Porkies, off the shores of Lake Superior, Michigan. It was recently ranked the best state park in the country, even beating out parks in Hawaii. Its beauty is breathtaking. My favorite time of the year is fall, because of the fiery autumn colors. It's home to picturesque lakes and hiking trails and rivers and waterfalls, even an abandoned mine and a ghost town. In the winter, the skiing is incredible. It's the biggest state park in Michigan, and home to a lot of wildlife, such as black bears, white-tailed deers, timber wolves, and moose. But sometimes you hear stories of other more mysterious things that lurk in the Porkies. Believe it or not, Lake Superior has its very own resident lake monster, known as Pessie. And while I do have a story about that, I'll save it for another day. This story is about something else that resides in the woods. One summer, we received reports of vandalism at the abandoned copper mine in Ghost Town, which is in more of a remote area of the park. There's a trail to the falls that passes by many of the old mine ruins and abandoned shafts. These are fenced off with signs due to heavy safety and preservation concerns. I was sent to check it out and was surprised to see one of the mine shaft structures pretty badly damaged. The strange thing was, it looked like something burst out from the inside of the shaft with rocks and rubble scattered about. As I looked around, I made out what appeared to be large footprints in the dirt leading to the surrounding woods. Once in a while, we do get reports of Sasquatch sightings, but they always turn out to be nothing. At the time, I had trouble believing this could actually be a Sasquatch, but I took pictures of the prints and reported it to my supervisor. Against my better judgment, I followed the footprints to see where they went, but the further I went into the woods, the more obscure they became. I was able to make out some broken branches and other telltale signs of something lumbering through here. But then I caught a whiff of this horrible stench, like rotting meat. I kept going deeper into the woods and finally came across a carcass of a bear. It looked like it had been dead for only a few days. It was partially eaten, but what made me nervous was that the bear was torn apart with a ferocity that I had never seen before. I couldn't imagine what could possibly do that to a bear, but it had to be massive and powerful. I finally decided it was time to get out of there. As I hustled back to the main trail, I was assaulted by another pungent stench, even worse than the carcass. It was the overwhelming smell of urine, wet dog, and sulfur. Then I heard this strange whooping sound nearby. Just thinking about it as I write this sends chills up my spine. It didn't sound like any animal I was familiar with. Something about it was just so primal. I quickened my pace and finally got to the trail and the ruins. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, but I was suddenly pelted with rocks, and it was coming from somewhere in the trees, but I couldn't see who or what was doing it. I heard that sound again, closer this time, and I took off as fast as I could. Whatever it was didn't seem to follow me, but it didn't stop until I got back to my truck. I raced to the ranger station and reported everything to my supervisor and showed him the pictures. He listened but didn't say a word, and I couldn't tell if he believed me or not. Together, we looked at trail cam footage in that area, and while we didn't see anything definitive, we did see a large figure covered in hair lurking in the foliage. It was too broad and humanoid to be a bear. My supervisor grabbed copies of the pictures from my phone, but then he told me to delete them immediately. I was confused, but he insisted I do it right in front of him. He was serious, and for my own job security, I did what I was told. He said not to tell anyone about it for the time being. The next day, he calls me into his office and reiterates that the DNT Parks and Recreation wanted to keep the situation quiet, as they didn't want to scare tourists and visitors unnecessarily. I reminded him of the mutilated bear carcass and said that it might actually be necessary after all. He just told me that it would be handled and we were to stay out of it. Camping areas and hiking trails around the falls, the Little Iron River, and Lost Creek were temporarily closed. I noticed some military vehicles driving into the area, with armed men dressed in camo. At first, I thought it was the National Guard, but there were no markings on the vehicles or their uniforms. I tried to follow them, but I was immediately stopped and told to stay away. A few days later, my supervisor informed me that the situation was resolved, whatever that meant, and the camping areas and hiking trails were reopened. I went back to the old mine ruins and was surprised to see that the destroyed mineshaft structure had been rebuilt, a bit haphazard, but close enough to the way it was before. The creature was never seen again. I don't know what happened to it, but I shudder to think what those armed men might have done. Who knows where it actually came from, but maybe it lived in the abandoned mines. I couldn't help but to think that maybe there were more of them down there, and that one day they could rise up again. That sounds crazy, I know. I kept a vigilant watch in that area ever since, but thankfully, we haven't had any issues. Not yet, at least. I worked in a national park for a few years in the Southwest. I don't really want to say the name of the park on here, but it's a pretty famous one, so you've most likely heard of it. I worked at one of the many information stations we had around the park. Mostly it involved handing out maps, explaining trails, and checking in guests for guided tours. Sometimes I got to give small tours and host educational talks about the history of the area and our local wildlife. We tended to hire quite a few seasonal staff during the busy season to keep things running smoothly. We didn't have as many visitors in the winter, so we could run on a skeleton staff. Typically, the trails would get some snow in December, January, and February. It's not usually much, but it's enough to make the trails icy and extremely dangerous. The unfortunate part about working the winter season with the skeleton crew was that we all had to do a little bit of everything. One day, I had been tasked to restock the cafeteria display in the main lodge. We don't offer room service or meals like a hotel, but we do have a cafeteria where our guests can purchase pre-made food. I would have to get up at 4 a.m. to have the display stocked before it opened. Now, I'm not much of a morning person, so I asked my supervisor if I could do it at night instead. I had the keys to the building and planned to go there after everything was shut down for the day. My supervisor was one of the lead rangers at the park. He said he didn't care when I got the cafeteria done, just that it was done before 6 a.m. I took this to mean that he knew I would be doing it at night, but judging by what happened later that night, he definitely forgot I was going to be there. I'll admit, I did start quite a bit later than I had planned. It was nearly 11 p.m. by the time I started restocking. I know that sounds pretty late, but I'm a night owl, and it was sort of nice to be able to work without anyone else there. I was only about 20 minutes into my task when I heard the cafeteria door open. I was in the back of the kitchen, but it was a heavy door, and there was no mistaking it. I knew only someone with a set of keys could be in here, so I knew it was one of my coworkers. I was about to check who it was when I heard my supervisor's voice. It sounded like he was talking on the phone. I heard him walk to the counter and grab something. Sounded like a yogurt cup, but that's really not important. I was still behind the kitchen door, but he was close enough that I could hear half of his phone conversation. It might be important for me to say that the cafeteria lights are always on at the front of the counter, even through the night. So he truly had no idea I was back there. I thought I should just probably walk out with an armful of food for the counter, so he would know that he wasn't alone. But then he started talking about some strange things, so I stayed back. He was talking about footprints on one of the main trails in the canyon. Bare footprints, as in without shoes. In December, there was a light dusting of snow on the ground, so any strange footprints should have been pretty easy to follow. I know there are some crazy hikers out there, but no way is someone hiking without shoes in this type of weather. At this point, I'm thinking that they're talking about a missing hiker, and we hadn't had any reports of missing hikers lately. But then my supervisor said something odd. He said, "It's best to leave it well enough alone. It doesn't want to harm anyone." It? That was the word that stuck out to me. He wouldn't have described an animal as being barefoot, and he wouldn't have called a person it. I didn't know what to think. I scooted closer to the kitchen door so I could hear better. The conversation sounded pretty tense. They weren't arguing, but they were close to it. My supervisor told the other person that their services weren't needed and that no one has had any negative encounter with the creature yet. Things got a little heated, and I couldn't hear everything that was said, but I do remember exactly what my supervisor said before he hung up the phone. He said, "If you want to hunt it, go ahead, but you'll never find it, even with a fresh trail. A lot of people have tried." I waited until I heard the front door open and close before I stuck my head out of the kitchen. I definitely wasn't supposed to hear that conversation, but I had to know what they were talking about. However, I was left with more questions than answers. I wasn't able to put the story together until the following day at lunch, when I was talking to one of my coworkers who had been working the morning shift in the cafeteria. She told me that a hiker had stopped to talk to her a bit. He was heading out a couple of days early because of the trail conditions. He tried to hike into the canyon, but had to turn back, and on his route back, he saw some footprints in the snow. Bare human footprints. He said he reported it to the ranger station and called the non-emergency police line and asked if there were any reports of missing people in the area, because the rangers weren't taking him seriously. He asked my coworker if she heard anyone that has gone missing. The hiker was convinced that there was someone out there wandering around the canyon without shoes. I didn't know what to think. I still don't know what to think. I haven't seen any strange creatures in the park myself, but from the little bits of information I overheard, I don't think these things want to be seen. I couldn't tell you what they look like, just that they have human feet, and according to my supervisor, they don't pose a threat to people, but I know there's something out there. My buddy Mark is a paleontologist for real, like one of those dudes you see in the movies. Anyway, once he had a fossil hunting expedition planned, and his usual group couldn't make it, so he asked me to go with him. Now, I don't know anything about it, but he promised to train me and feed me, so I agreed. We went in his Ford expedition out to this secret location in the Badlands. I assumed he had permission to go on this land, but I didn't really ask. He had his two-person tent in the back and a bunch of Dinty Moore beef stew, which isn't my idea of provisions, but I wasn't in charge of this thing. When we got there, it was late morning, but already hot. He gave me a hat and we started poking around in this big dry area of dirt and patches of grass. Part of it was a canyon, so it was like being inside a huge bowl. I got bored after about 20 minutes of watching him poke around, and I saw some strange tracks in the dirt that looked fresh. I asked him what he thought they were, and he said maybe a bird or something. It would have had to be a monster bird, though, because those tracks were as big as my feet. I followed them until they disappeared out of the canyons, just because I was bored. They seemed to go in a grassy place, and then off into a group of trees. I started Googling on my phone, and I couldn't find any tracks that looked like the ones I found. At least not that size. It sounds crazy, but they looked most like chicken feet. 3 toes with, in this case, huge claws. I asked Mark if he thought it might be a dinosaur, and he looked at me and told me to go drink some water. I did that and thought about the dinosaur idea. Thing is, this monster seemed to be walking on 2 legs. Finally, it got too dark to look anymore. I was starving, and even Dinty Moore sounded good. Mark got a fire going and heated up a couple of cans while I put up the tent. I forgot how bad I sleep in tents. Even though I was tired as heck from the day wandering around the canyon, I still couldn't sleep. I kept thinking I was hearing something walking around the outside of the tent, and I also couldn't stop thinking about those tracks. I guess I finally got to sleep though, because the next thing I knew, I smelled coffee. I went outside and Mark had another fire going, and he made a pot of coffee and some box mix pancakes. I wanted to use a bathroom before I ate, but of course, there was no bathroom out there. I went behind the tent and freaked out because I saw a ton of those tracks right at the back of the tent, like the thing had been pacing around there all night. Now, Mark had to be worried, I thought, so I brought him around the tent and showed him the tracks. He repeated that it had to be a bird. I put my foot next to the track to show him how big it was. I guess ostriches might have feet that big, but wouldn't we notice ostriches out here? Mark didn't have any theories, and he really wasn't that interested. He just wanted to look for fossils, which was pretty crazy to me. Why all the excitement about ancient dead creatures when we have a living one right around here? I was curious, but I wasn't scared until that night. I slept even worse than the night before, but Mark was out like a light. I got bored lying there trying to sleep, so I went outside and got another fire going. The fire made some crackling noises, but over it I heard something walking around. Not around, I realized, but toward me. A few seconds later I saw it. I thought at first it was just a trick of the firelight, because what I was seeing was a dinosaur thing standing upright, staring at me with these piercing yellow eyes. It looked like it was covered in snake-like scales. It had a snake or dinosaur or maybe like a lizard head. It kept coming toward me. I wanted to scream, but I was afraid if I did, Mark would come out of the tent and this thing would get both of us. I didn't know what to do, honestly. I ran around to the other side of the fire, thinking that it might throw the thing off and at least give me a few seconds to think. I couldn't just run because who knew if I'd be faster, and I couldn't get in the car and leave Mark. While I was thinking, the thing was coming around the fire slowly. I couldn't figure out why it just didn't attack and get it over with. Reptiles are fast. It could have eaten me by now. I decided that it was scared of the fire. At least, I hoped it was. I grabbed a stick that was on fire. I didn't even care if I burned myself at that point. It was better than dying. I ran at the thing like a crazy person, waving that stick around, figuring I had nothing to lose. It worked. The thing started to back away and finally turned and ran up the ridge. Once my heart stopped pounding, I realized I had no way to convince Mark to leave. I wish I'd gotten a picture of the thing so he knew I wasn't crazy. I sat by the fire until morning and it didn't come back. When the sun came up, I made coffee and breakfast and told Mark we had to go. I don't think he believed my story, but he agreed. Probably because he'd found a good number of fossils anyway. I told him he shouldn't come back here again, at least not at night, but I doubt he'll ever listen to me.
I used to be a ranger in Kentucky and handled quite a variety of duties over the course of my time there. At one point, part of my job was to keep the recreational shooting sports range operating. I grew up in a family that liked to shoot and hunt, so my dad had trained me to know what I was doing around guns. I really geek out about firearms, and I have a bit of an obsession with maintaining them and using them responsibly. I'd lived in Kentucky my whole life, and my family's land was nearby to the national forest where I worked. My family owns 20 acres of land, so I liked to go out there when I was practicing. I had purchased a new rifle and needed to sight in my gun after I bought it. I'd gotten a drum magazine and I wanted to test out its reliability. My family had owned that land for decades. Nothing weird had ever happened out there that I knew of. I'd taken people to that spot plenty of times. I had the brand new magazine and hadn't had a chance to use it yet. I grabbed my gun, the drum, and 20 rounds of ammo and went to the field I liked to use. To get to the field, I had to go through a barbed wire fence and a few hundred feet of wooded area. It was an unusually cold day. As soon as I crossed over the barbed wire, something felt off. I'd been there 1,000 times, and like I said, I never had any weird experiences. But something felt really strange that day. I kept going through because I thought I was being paranoid, or the wind and air pressure were just right to give an eerie feeling. So I walked on deeper into the woods. The further I got, the stronger the feeling was. I got halfway and the feeling was getting pretty intense. When I had grabbed my ammo, I hadn't loaded it into the magazine because I wanted to hurry and get out to the field so I could set everything up there. I stopped dead in my tracks and loaded the magazine with the 20 rounds I had brought. I felt like I needed to be ready, just in case. Then, out of nowhere, I smelled something dead. I'd been standing there for a few minutes with no scent, and then all of a sudden, it smelled like a month-old rotting carcass was beside me. I looked around, and behind me I saw a mangled animal. Aside from the smell, it looked pretty fresh. It was just so mangled, though. It was really hard to tell what it was. It was a white-gray color. I thought it was a rabbit or a possum. The smell didn't go along with the freshness of the carcass. Whatever that stench was, it wasn't coming from the animal. I finished loading the magazine and stuck it in my gun. I held the bolt open so that if I tripped, the gun wouldn't fire accidentally. I was nearly out of the thick woods, and I could see the field I was heading to straight ahead. The whole time, I'd been walking alongside a creek. The creek turns to the left as you approach the field. As I got to the turn in the creek, I heard a loud splash in the water. I turned around, and what I saw, I'll never forget. The thing was easily 8 feet tall and was standing on 2 legs. Besides the water splash, it was dead silent. It had very long arms and long legs. It was light brown, like grayish brown. It didn't look like fur, though, more like skin. The skin was really bedraggled and hanging off of it. It looked severely malnourished. It was incredibly skinny, and the skin was tight across its body. Imagine taking a fully grown man that only weighs 120 pounds and stretching him out to be 8 feet tall. It had an odd walk, too, but that could have been caused by the mud near the creek bed. It never faced me, so I didn't get a chance to see its front. It just kept walking and never turned around. I think the freakiest thing about it was its size. It scared the absolute crap out of me. I tried to close the bolt on my gun to chamber around just in case it turned around to fight. I had no intention of shooting unless it gave a sign it was going to attack. But when I tried to chamber around, the magazine wouldn't let go of the round. The force of the bolt closing would break your finger if you were to close it on your finger. I'd been loading and unloading the magazine the day before to help loosen the spring to make it easier to load in the future. I could take the rounds out with my hand, but when I came across this terrifying creature, somehow, it decides it wants to hold on to the freaking bullet. By now, the thing was out of my sight, and I was just standing there feeling defenseless. After it walked off, I realized if I had shot, I would have deafened myself. It caught me so off guard that I almost fired a .556 round in a heavily wooded area without ear protection. I had brought some with me, but didn't have it on. I have no idea what that thing was, but all I can do is thank God it walked away from me. The weird thing was, I had the feeling it was something not of this world. And it's not like me to think that. It felt like something almost supernatural. The magazine never did work right. I had to send it back because it was tearing up my ammo. I never saw that thing again, but I always felt really paranoid in the area after that.
I worked as a park ranger for a time in the Black Hills of South Dakota. My goal after graduating college with a degree in conservation was to work somewhere in the Rockies, but a job working the Black Elk Wilderness came up, and I took it. The Black Elk Wilderness is home to Black Elk Peak, formerly Harney Peak, and is the highest point of South Dakota. Fortunately, it's a very scenic and decently easy route to the top that most hikers can manage. Unfortunately, that meant a lot of tourists, and coupled with the fact that we were in Custer State Park, which is home to a couple of large bison herds that are easily spotted from the road, the tourists flocked there in droves. It wasn't that I hated the tourists. Wilderness areas need tourists for income. It was just that I had expected to work more with nature and less with people. Twice a week, I was scheduled to patrol the watchtower at the top of the mountain. It was about 7 miles round trip, and I had to hike in. I loved it. Getting up before the weekend warrior crowd and hiking in as the sun rose. I lasted 2 years at that job before I found another one close by. Less tourists and more time in nature sounded perfect to me. I didn't have to warn families about the dangers of trying to pet bison anymore. I would be working for the Black Hills National Forest. Not quite the start of the Rockies yet, but I was moving in that direction. I was thrilled to be working there. I love to be out in nature and seeing all sorts of wildlife. There was a lot of trail and road maintenance to be done my first summer. They were also working on a program monitoring populations of several wildlife species, so I was scheduled to be working outdoors in one way or another for practically the entire season. One task I had been working on was rerouting an access road and part of a hiking trail around an area that had been washed out by some unusually heavy rains. It was a big undertaking, so we had been working in teams to get it done by the end of the fall season. Normally, the teams consisted of 4 or 5 people at a time, but sometimes we were stuck working with just 1 or 2 others, depending on the other needs in the area. Things were going well with the project, so I was able to take a small vacation. 4 days hiking in the Rockies in Wyoming. The day I drove home from my trip, I swung by the forest. There was still at least an hour of daylight left, and I was curious to see how far the rest of the crew got on the project. I don't know why I just didn't wait until morning when I came into work. I should have waited until morning. I went down the old access road, and it looked like they had taken down several more trees to make a larger parking area. I saw something move in the underbrush at the edge of the forest. I stopped my car and turned the radio down. It looked like something large. Maybe an elk or a bear. I couldn't quite tell. The sun was setting quickly. I thought I had more time than that, but Night comes early in the mountains and has a hard time getting through the trees if you're in the woods. I waited in my car to see if I could get a better look at the animal. I knew if I got out, I would likely scare it away. Out of nowhere, I heard a loud crash and a tree topple over right next to my car. It was insane. The whole car shook when it fell. I couldn't believe the odds, or how lucky I was that it didn't crush me. I got out of the car and took a look at the fallen tree. It looked healthy, no signs of decay. It didn't come up at the roots, but rather looked like it just broke off and fell. The whole thing was strange, but I was tired from my trip and just wanted to get back home. I was about to get back into my car when I heard another tree break apart and fall. It landed just a few feet away from the previous one. At this point, I didn't know what was going on. If a third tree fell, it would probably land right on me. I knew I had to get out of there. I had to turn the car around and maneuver around the fallen trees. And then I saw it standing there in the forest. The creature was knocking down the trees. I saw its eyes shine in my headlights. They were gold. I would guess it had to stand between 8 or 9 feet tall. Its whole body was covered in hair, like an ape or some similar animal. Saying it looked like Bigfoot or Sasquatch makes me sound like a crazy person, but that's really the only thing that it could have been. I don't know what else out there looks like that. It definitely wasn't a bear. It had these human hands and just thick hair all over its body. I didn't stick around long after that. It started shaking another tree, and I drove out of there. There were 3 trees down when the team got there for work the next day. I ended up telling my coworkers about this, but they just thought I was crazy.
I just got back from a week-long trip to Florida. My fiancée and I were visiting her parents, who own a home in Boca Raton, and I was hoping to get a fishing trip in with her father, Jim, while I was there. The Everglades aren't too far from where they live, and her dad owned a small boat. And since he's retired, he spends a good deal of time taking it out on some of the local lakes. I ran the idea of fishing the glades past him, and he seemed to be just as excited as me. Despite being in the vicinity, he had actually never fished it. Well, a few days after we got there, we made arrangements and set out early in the morning, towing his boat behind us. It wasn't one of the boats from the movies, with the big fans. It was a nice little 14-foot tracker, which was perfect for the narrow waterways. We're both kind of anti-technology. YouTube videos and computer solitaire is the extent of our interest. So like fools, neither one of us brought a satellite GPS, and we both left our phones in the truck. Anyway, we got to the glades and got the boat in the water around 9 a.m. We planned to fish around 2 and then head back home and be there in time for dinner. We hadn't planned on getting lost. It was a blast at first. We saw a few alligators, which I'd never seen in the wild. We stopped to fish a few times and even caught a few largemouths each. I guess around 1 p.m. when we figured we should start heading back in the direction we came. We were both adept at navigation and kept aware of when and where we had turned, but it didn't really help. We had seriously underestimated the labyrinth of channels and canals, and it didn't take us long to realize that we'd gotten lost in the maze of the Everglades. We weren't panicking, yet, but by this time it was well past 2 p.m. and we couldn't tell if we'd made any progress or not. We had just come around the turn of yet another channel when I saw something bizarre. Some thing that had been standing along one of the banks dove into the water just as we made the turn. I only caught a glimpse of it, but it had been standing upright on 2 legs and had a green, scaly complexion. I convinced myself that it was just an alligator and maybe the sun had caught it at a weird angle. Besides, we had bigger problems. The sun was getting low in the sky, and we hadn't seen a single other person. We didn't have much water, and we were still completely lost. I really regret thinking I was macho enough to not need a GPS. A few canals later, I happened to turn around and caught sight of something in the water right behind the boat. It looked like an alligator, but it was moving way too fast, and it was speeding directly towards me. I was in the back on the motor, and I gunned the throttle in surprised response. A bunch of things happened at once. Not expecting the sudden shift in speed, my soon-to-be father-in-law fell back against the side of the boat and tumbled into the water. At the same time, the creature that had been tailing us rose out of the water and lashed out toward me with a set of razor-sharp claws. When I say rose, I mean stood up, on two legs like a human would. Gunning the engine is probably what saved me as the swipe fell short. I burst forward a few feet and got a good look at this thing. The water was around 5 feet deep there, and this thing was standing up, the waterline around its waist. It had a pair of thickly muscled arms, each sporting one of those clawed fists that had almost decapitated me. Greenish-black scales ran the length of it, and it terminated in a flat head, jaw open, bearing 2 rows of serrated teeth. I saw Jim hit the water and immediately start splashing around. I knew he could swim, but being launched from a boat into alligator-infested waters is probably the kind of thing to cause you to panic. The only problem was that this thing was between me and Jim. I couldn't leave him, and I couldn't get around this thing. There was no room. I'm not saying I'm brave, because I certainly didn't feel courageous in the moment. But I turned the boat around quickly, twisted the throttle as far as I could, and charged. The bow of the boat lifted into the air. I couldn't see past it, but I felt an impact, and the boat shuddered, almost tipping to the left. I let go of the throttle and pulled alongside the frantic Jim and grabbed his arm. I started hauling him in and looked back over my shoulder. The wake from the short burst was lapping against both sides of the channel, and thick rings of water flowing away from where I guessed the creature had been. It was nowhere in sight. I brought Jim into the boat and not too gently threw him to the deck, plopped back down next to the motor, and sped away up the channel. We didn't see the creature again. After a few hours, we eventually ran into a group of guys who led us back to the boat ramp. We were only about 20 minutes away and had pretty much been going in circles the whole time. We each had about a dozen missed calls from our wives. I think Jim was pretty upset with me, but eventually he came around and laughed it off. He had never actually seen the thing and thought I had just overreacted to an alligator. But I know that it wasn't. Alligators don't stand on 2 feet, and they don't attack with their claws. I don't know if it's a species of animal that hasn't been encountered yet, or a weird human-alligator hybrid. But whatever it is, it probably shouldn't exist. This happened back in either 2000 or 2001. I can't really remember which, but it was around there, so quite a while ago. I have a group of friends that loves the outdoors and loves to explore different areas around the country. We've been all over, from East Coast to West, North and South. It's been a lot of fun over the years. I prefer the North as I'm not a fan of being hot and sweaty, but we vote on where we're going next. So we got the group together, and half chose to go to Big Cypress National Preserve in Florida. I wanted to go to Alaska, but it was only me and my buddy John who chose Alaska, unfortunately. I agreed on Florida on the condition we didn't go in the summer, which was debated for about an hour over lunch. Finally, I convinced enough of my friends that it was a good idea. We compromised on going in September, where it's still warm but not excruciatingly hot like in the middle of summer. We planned on hiking, biking, canoeing, and staying at multiple campsites throughout the park. We'd even planned to try some of the primitive sites without all the modern creature comforts. We decided we'd check out Everglades National Park as well, since it's right next door to Big Cypress. We drove east down the main road called the Tamiami Trail to the scenic route that brought us to the Concho Billy Trail. Finally, we get to the trail, park the cars, and get our bikes out. We all took pictures of the green Concho Trail sign, and that's when we first smelled something rank, kind of skunk-like. That's not unusual though out in nature, and we set out on the trail. The smell passed pretty quickly, about 10 minutes into our ride. We stopped again after about a mile and heard this loud call from the trees. It was low, almost a rumble, but it carried. We all just looked at each other and put our fingers up to our lips. I know there's no mountain lions in the park, but I wasn't sure if there was a bear or not. Twice we heard it call out, and my friend Annie even recorded it on her phone. We waited after the second call about 20 minutes. Then we got back on our bikes and took off. We traveled barely half a mile more when we heard the call again. We stopped to listen, and then we smelled an awful rank smell again. This time it was like a mix of skunk and strong urine. That's the best I can describe it. The calls seemed farther out than we'd heard before, but the smell seemed to just permeate the entire area. It was incredibly strong. Annie decided to record the sounds again with her phone. We stayed there maybe 10 minutes, and something crashed in the trees off to our right, maybe 30 feet away from us. We didn't stay to see what it was. We got on our bikes and we hauled as fast as we could back to the cars. I don't know what it was. We got back in the cars and took off back to camp. We were all laughing at each other and kind of freaking out together. We got back to camp and we told our story to a few people, even played the recordings. No one knew what it was, but we did learn that there is indeed black bear that live in the preserve. What we heard wasn't a bear though, and that smell seemed to show up with the calls. We've had odd encounters before in our travels, but this one takes the cake. To this day, no one knows what we heard. We've played the calls to many people, even some animal people, hunters and some rangers we've met in our travels. No one can identify the calls. It's really strange.